All right, so we're going to look at today's class for uh, a little bit of a shift in terms of time, still remaining in Greek literature, moving on from Homeric Greek to Athenian Greek, that of the Athenian tragedians, looking at a very different genre than the one we just occupied ourselves with. So we looked at the epic in Homer's Odyssey and averred to another epic that was also written by Homer, namely the Iliad. But now we're going to move on to a work that is, if not equally famous, certainly of a great deal of fame on its own, and one that has passed likewise down through the ages and is well known by generations upon generations of writers and thinkers, and has piqued the imagination all the way from the time in which it was written. So exalted it was that Aristotle featured Oedipus the King as for him, the exemplary form of the tragedy, all the way up until the time of Sigmund Freud, who gives us what we now speak of as the Oedipus complex. And in his own version of this play, Freud underlines a passage which gave rise to the famous phrase that he used to describe it. But we're dealing with Greek drama now, and I need to say a little bit about that because there is an element in which this is rather different than what we saw in the previous work of Greek literature. Now, as I said at that point, and one of the features we noted about the Greek epic was that it was strongly involving the gods in the machinery of the epic. So the muses were invoked at the outset, in that case, the epic muse, Calliope, and the muses being the 9 goddesses that sprung from the goddess of memory. And likewise, here we have the muse being appealed to, but this time it's the tragic muse. And so likewise, we're drawing upon memory, and in general, the tragedies that we have extant and have recorded for us, something like 30 um, dramas in general from the period, but in terms of tragedies, much fewer than that. They tend to be based on mythology, mythology that had been passed on through memory. So the account of Oedipus is something that our tragedian Sophocles did not himself invent, but rather something that he himself had heard, had passed on through memory. And what constitutes his particular genius is his rendering of that account. Now, as far as the rendering of that goes, I should say something about this and maybe set him in the context of his age and in the context in which we find tragedies and why they were written, and some of the specific features that we will note about this particular tragedy. So let me take a step back and say something about that. Greek drama in general, emerges around 500 BC. And when it does so, both tragedy and comedy both arise out of the festivals dedicated not to all the gods, but to a particular god, namely that of Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is the god of poetry, also the god of wine, and is associated with all manner of excess. You'll note him in under various names, one of them also being Bacchus, referred to perhaps most familiarly for our audience here in terms of C.S. Lewis, putting him in his um, Chronicles of Narnia. He appears at various points. So he's a god of celebration and of wine. Also orgiastic festivals. So Greek drama is associated with the worship of a particular god, and it takes place over the course of a number of days, and it takes place in terms of a series of plays as well. So often they're not just devoted to the Olympian gods, in this case Dionysus, but also there's a competition that takes place along with this. And each writer that is seeking to compete for the prize at the Dionysian Games will produce something like a trilogy and of plays, and to which they will also append, at least early on, a shorter play, often called a satyr play. And the satyrs are these creatures that have goat-like hooves and bodies like a man. And originally they were relatively static in their form, involving a single actor and an actor wearing a mask. And the mask has a particular function, but it also has a certain effect as well, which is also interesting to note. But as for the function, if you want to look online, you will see that the ancient Greek theater was often performed outside in an amphitheater, but the amphitheater only has one side. Now, the side in which the audience sits is made of marble, and the acoustics of the theater are particularly good, such that an actor down at the bottom of this long amphitheater can be heard at the very top. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, the marble with which the theater itself is made, and the shaping of the theater around the actor so that it preserves the sound. But that's also the function of the mask. The mask itself has an amplification effect. So when I hold my hand over my mouth, it projects the sound out in a particular way. And I would submit to you that the mask also does that very thing. So it has a sort of a technical function, do the masks. But they also do something that we don't normally associate with acting. And because we're accustomed to, when we think of acting, to seeing actors on stage and seeing their faces and seeing the emotions that are being expressed by the actors, the changes in their emotions, in fact, by looking at their faces, among other things. If you think about it a little bit, though, if you're in a theater and in an amphitheater and you're at quite a distance from the actor, it's impossible to see the actor's face. And so acting in terms of expressing emotions through the face is, quite frankly, unnecessary and even superfluous. So the character's inner state is reflected rather through the outer state, which is on the mask. And I have included a link on the course web page of one version of that, which I think is helpful. In its more original form, the actors themselves wearing masks and going through the motions of acting the performance. If you're robbed of the capacity to move your face and act and express your emotions and your interactions with other characters through gesture and through your facial expressions, then you're going to have to do it by other means. And the means of the actor of these days would, of course, be primarily through their voice. The voice which was amplified by the mask. Now, the mask itself would have not just been any old mask. It would have been a mask that was particularly associated with the character of that particular character. So in the case of Oedipus, I'm not sure exactly what the mask would have looked like, but suffice it to say that it's a static portrait of the actor. And it's the thing that we most associate with the actor. I wonder if at the outset of the tragedy of Oedipus the King, we don't have a man of noble mien or of unblemished aspect, but rather of a portrait of suffering. I suspect that that would be the case, but I don't have any knowledge of that fact. But the mask is being worn, and there's also a masked chorus early on, and the chorus would have comprised something like 50 boys or men, and they would have sang or danced in praise of Dionysus on the stage in front of him. That's how things would have happened originally. So there was one actor. So let me say something about the development of tragedy as a literary form. There are in general, three great Athenian tragic dramatists that we acknowledge and to this day read with considerable pleasure. The first of which comes under the name of Aeschylus, and that's with an A-E, S-C-H-Y, L-U-S, Aeschylus. And Aeschylus is often called the father of the tragedy, or even the creator of the tragedy, even though he's probably not the first one to have written it. And according to Aristotle, the reason why Aeschylus deserves his fame is because he invented something about the tragedy that had not been there before, namely a second actor. And that second actor has a rather striking effect on the drama. You can imagine a drama with one actor and with the chorus of 50 before was probably a relatively boring thing, but the introduction of a second actor had a significant effect. And the second actor allows, dramatically speaking, to set the hero in a position that is, relatively speaking, innocent. The second actor, in other words, can now act as a foil for the original actor. And as Kitto notes, the tragic implications of the second actor are more important than the dramatic ones. As the situation moves, the hero must be of a certain kind. He must, and I'm quoting here, if we are to have tragedy, be of such a moral constitution as to oppose himself to this movement, not to conform to it. In other words, the moving plot was designed to display and test moral character, to give room for moral choice and for its results. And so the decisive moment in tragedy is when the moral standing of the actor, the main protagonist, is emphasized by the use of the secondary actor. And so in Aeschylus's drama, and he's born, we're not quite sure, somewhere between 525 and 512 BC, he introduces the second actor. And in general, Aeschylus was the most successful of the Greek tragic poets, and died somewhere around, what have I got here, 456 BC. Wrote something between 70 and 90 plays, won something like a dozen first prizes. But he's not the one that we're going to focus on today. The one we're going to focus on today is the poet by the name of Sophocles. Now, Sophocles is an interesting figure, and he introduces a third actor into the mix. And that further enhances the dramatic possibilities for the play, I would submit to you. Now, let me say something a little bit about Aeschylus. Let me name the third of the three, by the way. The third tragedian's name is Euripides. I'm not going to spend any time talking about Euripides, just simply to mention his name here. It was believed by the Athenians that Euripides had to some degree undermined the tragedy and destroyed its moral weight, but I'll leave that criticism aside for now and say a little bit about Oedipus here, or rather Sophocles. Sophocles is a really interesting character in his own right as a man. Born to a wealthy family in a suburb of Athens, and like so many of the figures of his day, was not only a writer, but also was involved in Athenian public life in the same way that many of the famous figures that we will know, like Plato and Aristotle would have been, and Socrates for that matter. He was even the treasurer of the city of Athens, and served even as a general. And he had sons who also became playwrights, and he himself had friends of particular fame that will pass on to our very day, namely the historian Herodotus, the father of history, as well as the great statesman Pericles, whose famous funeral ode was captured by the second famous Greek historian, Thucydides. But so this is an age of famous Greek men, famed for everything from their political endeavors, Pericles, to their historic enterprises, Herodotus, to their work as tragedians, as I say here, Sophocles. So this is a famous and fascinating age in which to have lived, and no doubt full of color and light. the story of Oedipus the King. Let me say a little bit about Oedipus the King. Now, I've called it Oedipus the King. In the Greek, it's Oedipus Tyrannus, and Tyrannus has different connotations than simply the connotation that we associate with it, namely a tyrant. Tyrannus is simply a king that has come into his position not through natural birth, but by other means. The word for a king that has received it passed on through ancestral means is basileus. That's a king. Tyrannus is one that has come to it by other means. Now, often a tyrannus does have the connotations of being a tyrant, but not necessarily so. And I just wanted to say that. As for the trilogy, just talking around, throwing around some interesting tidbits about this. I said that the way that tragedies were performed often had three parts, or there was a trilogy of plays, but that doesn't mean that they all were produced at the same time. And in the case of the three that comprise Sophocles' tragedy, Oedipus, Antigone, Oedipus Tyrannus, and Oedipus at Colonus, there's a large span of time between these three plays. So Antigone is written around 441 BC. Oedipus Tyrannus around 428 BC, so 13 years later. And the conclusion of the trilogy, Oedipus at Colonus, it wasn't staged until 405 BC, so 23 years later after Oedipus Tyrannus. So between the four plays, we have something like 26 years, or 36 years rather, of time. And the final installment was a year before the author's death. And so this is rather interesting, and it shows that there was a not only an ongoing interest in the author Sophocles around the theme of Oedipus and his significance and his meaning for Athenian life, but also that he kept that up until the very end of his days, his preoccupation with the mythical story of Oedipus and what happened there. And that's because when we're dealing with a tragedy, we're not just dealing with a tale dedicated to Dionysius, and therefore to us of, quite frankly, marginal interest, if any interest, because we're not in general interested in the god Bacchus or the Dionysian festivals when we're watching Oedipus the King. It's more because of the themes that arise out of the story of this terrible fate that was suffered by Oedipus, so terrible that he is mentioned by Homer in the underworld. And we meet one of the figures associated with that tale, and I mentioned this when we were dealing with that passage in the underworld in Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, the prophet Tiresias, who is one of the main figures that we do meet here in the play. And I'll get to him in a moment, because there are things about Tiresias which I find are particularly ironic and are particularly poignant in light of some of the main themes of Oedipus the King. The themes of blindness and insight, or blindness and prophecy, or of health and of sickness. There are certain dichotomies that are presented in the play, which quite frankly go down very deep, not only into the Greek understanding of how the gods relate to humanity, but also of how we do. Because we noted last time when we were looking at the epic, the conclusion of the Odyssey, that these themes of judgment, the judgment of the gods, and also of apocalypse, or of the emergence of something hidden and is now finally appearing, it coincides with the emergence of Odysseus. The judgment of the gods falls at the same time. In the same way, there's something here in this tragedy which is hidden, Namely, what Oedipus has done is hidden to the man Oedipus, who is seeking to get to the bottom of what had been done. And at the same time, when it is revealed in an apocalyptic fashion, the judgment of the god falls upon him, the judgment that had been rendered at the beginning. So there are some similarities in viewpoint here between the epic and also the tragedy with respect to those motifs of blindness and also of apocalypse. And in this case, there's something here which is quite frankly not far from a biblical understanding of something that is needed to deal with the judgment of the gods, namely a remedy or a pharmakos. Now, pharmakos in Greek, as Plato notes, has multiple implications, and they're not just multiple, they're opposite implications in some ways. Pharmakos, on the one hand, can be a poison which he will take, and you can kill somebody through a pharmakos. On the other hand, it can also be something that is a remedy to a poison. And if you think about it, this is how remedies often work: a little bit of a little bit of what ails you. So to this day, if you are one of the treatments for something that one is deathly allergic to is a little bit of the original in small dosages repeated, and you build up a resistance to the antibodies, etc. But here the pharmakos functions as something of an atoning figure. So in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, the pharmakos is like the scapegoat that the priest lays his hands upon in Leviticus 16, and the sins of the people are transferred to that scapegoat, and the scapegoat bears their sins into the wilderness. And that is a sort of exactly what is happening here in the story of Oedipus. Oedipus, who desires to get to the bottom of the mystery of what is destroying the city of Thebes, is going to end up being something like a scapegoat for the sins of the city. And he is going to be driven from their midst at the end of the play. And so because he becomes associated with the impurity, and in fact, Oedipus even urges his brother-in-law Creon to exile him from the city when it is finally revealed to him that he is unclean. And so he becomes almost like a beast, driven from the city, blinded into the wilderness. And as a result of that, the city, which had been plagued by Apollo and was being destroyed out of his wrath at Oedipus's great sin, is alleviated from that terrible burden. So the judgment of the god has been avoided by the apocalyptic revelation that Oedipus is in fact the cause of the problem to begin with. So as I say, some similarities in the themes between the epic, as we saw it in the Homeric epic, and the Athenian tragedy here. So that in that sense, they're similar. But in the epic, it didn't seem like it was so close to home. Whereas here, it seems more related to human nature. There's a problem with human nature, these tragedies are suggesting. And that problem can only be alleviated through atonement, through a sacrifice. And the sacrifice will have to be dealt with in order for the city to avert the judgment of the gods, in this case of Apollo. So I think all these things are very interesting, not just on the surface, but fundamentally interesting, and they remain interesting. And this is why we're not only reading this as a matter of historical interest, saying that this was an influential play. It remains of interest because these themes of a guilt that resides in the human breast, in the human frame, a guilt that must be purged, not simply acknowledged, but simply must be cast out from our midst, remains with us. And in a Christian understanding, of course, we would call that sin. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second here. But let me gather my thoughts here, and before I go on with that discussion. But let me see. I've covered that here. I've talked about Sophocles' literary undertaking. I mentioned that Sophocles wrote about 120 plays, and we have only about 7 left. It's an annual festival. There's a choric dance. The chorus probably wearing something like goat's hooves. This is a tragedia that is often people associate it with a goat dance. A tragos is a goat, and so there's some sense and certainly historically a belief that tragic actors would stride the stage with something like heels on that would make a clopping noise on the stage, as opposed to the comedies in which they wore soft shoes that would not make this noise. And there's something that is it's an idealized spectacle that has a theologically weighty significance. And I think I've said a fair bit about that. The thing that leads to the judgment of the gods, let me say a little bit more about this. In this particular case, is an act which is so abominable that it remains taboo to this very day. And there are actually 2 things. One of them is the terrible crime of murdering one's father, parricide. Now, as I said to you when we were talking about the Greek epic, it was something that Zeus himself was guilty of. He murdered his father Kronos. So that's not the main force of the problem here, as bad as that is. So he murdered his father, and this is an abhorrent taboo that has been broken by murdering his father. But in addition to that, he also commits incest with his mother. And so the taboo of incest, which has been broken here, goes a little bit, it's deeper than simply saying that this is an immoral action. It's far more deeply ingrained as an awful act that simply cannot be dealt with by the law. It has to be dealt with by religious means. And that really seems to be the focus here that of tragedy, and this is why it needs to be expiated or atoned for by driving the individual out with the sin of the city upon him and driving him out. So there's a basic human law that has been violated here, and he is driven out as a beast from their midst. So, so it has a, I also want to say, a fundamentally theological significance. Now, the Greek theological framework here is not the same as a biblical theological framework, and one of the reasons for that is I think that in the understanding of Greek drama, we have to have an understanding of what the Greeks' understanding of the gods are before we can really do that. The chief problem that for Oedipus, and the chief thing that he does wrong, is he commits a hamartia. Now, hamartia is one of the words in the, I'll say something more about this next time, but hamartia is a word that's used in the New Testament for sin. It's one of the words used for sin. And it's the one that is associated with missing a mark. So it's often used in archery. When you commit a hamartia, you take a shot and you don't even hit the target at all. It's not only that you don't hit the bullseye, you miss the target entirely. Now, hamartia can just simply be a mistake, however, a mistake of judgment that has terrible consequences. It doesn't necessarily entail a conscious awareness of a moral transgression, and that's certainly the case here with Oedipus. Oedipus is oblivious to the fact that he's committed a terrible wrong, that he has in fact murdered his father, and he has had children with his mother. He's totally oblivious to that. So when Aristotle says that a hamartia has been committed by Oedipus. He's not talking about an awareness of moral guilt. Nonetheless, the moral guilt remains. Likewise, he's guilty, and this might be even more to the point here, he's guilty of hubris. Now, hubris is often associated in English, and these words, by the way, that I'm using, the Greek words, and I'll, again, as I said, I'll say more about this next time. These Greek words, which Aristotle uses to describe the tragedy in general, and particularly Sophocles' tragedy, have passed on in the English language to this day. So we use the word hamartia, New Testament studies that speak of hamartology, the study of sin. But we also use the word hubris, and hubris is often connected with pride. And it's really that pride, though, is not in the moral sense that with which we will commonly associate it now either. It's an overreach, and it's an overreach in the sense that it's a going beyond the limits of human knowledge and human action, and it's transgressing thereby into the realm of the gods. And the reason I say that is, in that sense, the whole modern scientific enterprise is marked by, at least from the Greek vantage point, hubris, because we're seeking to go beyond the limits of human knowledge and action and move into other areas of knowledge and action. And for the Greeks, this would simply be hubris. For us, we speak of it as progress. There's probably a line in between those two positions where we could consider that modern progress does have an element of hubris about it, but it doesn't. We don't immediately associate with that with moving into the realm of the gods' territory, and that's because of our different understanding of theology. I'll submit to you. So modern science is inseparable from Christianity, and the belief that we not only can know about God's work in nature, but that it honors him to search further into it and to understand the mind of God and how he's created all these things. There are many books that are written on this. I could refer you to them, and I maybe put them on the course website for those of you that are interested in this. But the modern scientific age is really inaugurated by Christians who have this firm belief that it's honoring to God to know more about the universe, and we can know more about it because it's comprehensible. So these things are needful to say here. The Greeks, on the other hand, have a different understanding of human nature and also of the divine nature. So how about human nature? Well, if human nature, we can only rise so far. There's a limit to where we can go in life. If our station in life is that of a slave, then that is the terrible, tragic state in which we are born, and we will stay in that state. On the other hand, if we're born in a position like a king, we must not aspire to be higher than that, because when we do that, we start to move into the realm of the gods, and that's going to be a problem. I'll say more about that in a second. But it is possible for a man who is of the highest station, let's say like a tyrannus, a king, to fall from that station to a lesser station. That is entirely possible as well. But when a man seeks to presume upon his ability and his knowledge and to move into the territory of gods, this is where the word hubris kicks in, because at that point, the gods beat him back down. Now, why is that? The reason is quite simply because the Greek gods are finite, and therefore their relation to human beings is a sort of zero-sum game, insofar as the further the human beings build themselves up in their greatness, the more they threaten the gods because they take away from the glory of the gods. And this is always a danger, and it's chiefly a danger to the foremost of the Greek men. And so therefore the Greek men, the pious men like Odysseus, or Achilles or Agamemnon, they are regularly offering sacrifices to the gods because they are aware that their greatness threatens the gods in their greatness, because there's a limited amount to greatness, because the gods themselves are finite. And so when the humans gain glory, it is often at the expense of the gods. Now, you might say, well, that sounds a bit like what Christians talk about. We must give God the glory and so forth, and let's not be prideful and so forth. But when Christians talk about this way, we don't mean the same thing that the Greeks mean by this. So in the Christian understanding, we are to submit ourselves to a person who is infinitely greater in every respect than we are. Infinitely. He's not a finite being who's threatened by our greatness. That's not the reason why we need to give honor and glory to God. So we are to do so because he's worthy of this. It's not because he's threatened by our greatness. So God's existence and his knowledge and his omnipotence is not a limit or a barrier to our knowing or our being or our achievements. And in fact, our whole existence is dependent on God's favor and his benevolence. Whereas in the Greek view, as I say, it's a zero-sum game. If my existence becomes too glorious, if my knowledge becomes too great, and if my achievements are simply too splendid, then it will threaten the gods themselves in all of these areas, because they are finite, and there's only a finite amount of those things, all of which the gods covet, to go around. So that's the problem for the Greeks, and it's the problem that particularly bedevils this man, Oedipus, because Oedipus has been raised up to be the position of a tyrannus, a king. And not only is he a king, he's a king that came into his position because he solved the riddle of the phoenix. Phoenix. It's not the phoenix. Why am I saying the phoenix? The Sphinx. The Sphinx. I was thinking to myself, it's a word that's like the riddle of the Sphinx. Now, what was the riddle of the Sphinx? And what was going on with the Sphinx? Well, the Sphinx, as we know, is a mythological beast who has the body of a lion and the head of a man. And the Sphinx was plaguing the city of Thebes and destroying it as a judgment. And the Sphinx had a riddle that he was asking everyone who came to him, and as a way of alleviating the destruction. And the riddle went like this: what goes about on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 legs in the noonday, and on 3 legs in the evening? And nobody can answer the riddle. And so the Sphinx was destroying the city as a consequence. But of course, Oedipus solved the riddle, because the riddle of the Sphinx was, the answer to this is man. Man goes about on 4 legs, crawling like a baby in the morning, on 2 legs in the afternoon of his life, and by the end of his days, he's slouched over, going about on 3 legs, because of course he's using a cane to walk. And so the answer, and at the heart of Oedipus the King, and this is what makes it a perennially fascinating play of interest, not only to those who celebrate Dionysian festivals, but for as a matter of human interest to this very day, is the fact that this is a play about mankind, about the limits of humanity, about the way in which human greatness, all too often, those who are glorious in our midst have feet of clay and are brought down to earth. But even more than that, that there is a problem that is endemic in the human condition that needs to be alleviated, and can only be done so by means of atonement. And that problem for Christians will be the problem of sin, as I said to you. So, but those things I think are of interest at the outset, and worthy of drawing our attention to. I will say something more about that in a second, but let me leave it off at that and leave you that to chew on, and then I will move on in our second part to move on to further themes in Oedipus Rex, and I shall see you then.